And we're back. Okay, so the final thing I want to do in association with progressive era is to do an assessment. It seems to me it's tailor-made for assessing. There was a problem that was facing America coming out of 1900. The middle class reformers, of course, rise up in massive way to try to confront those problems, and do a bunch of stuff. So the question becomes, how successful were they in terms of their efforts? And this is actually the way I'm also asking you guys to end the essay question. So here's my analysis of the progressive era. And I'm going to call it the good, the bad, and the ugly. Don't know that theme song, but that was for a spaghetti western with Clint Eastwood called The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. But I do just feel like the good, the bad, and the ugly is a kind of effective way of trying to understand what's going on with the progressive era. What that means, of course, is that there were some things that were good that happened, there were some things that were not so good that would happen, and then there's one side of the progressive era that's just downright ugly that I'll have to highlight for you guys. So anyway, let's begin to look at the progressive era in terms of these three major areas. So we're going to start with the good. So I do actually think that there were a number of really good things that come out of the progressive era, and of course, if we were in the classroom, I'd ask you to have you tell me what you thought sounded good after you had to listen to so much about the progressive era. But I'm hoping the things that you might have considered that were good were the fact that they did significant efforts to clean up politics. I mean, the old machine system, the overt corruption of the Gilded Age, pretty much is going to disappear in terms of the progressive era as politics became so much cleaner. Intriguingly, of course, the number of people voting went down, though, because of less voter fraud, less voter corruption. But the system was so much cleaner, of course, continues in many ways to be to this day. There's talk of voter fraud, but the incidence of voter fraud in America is so minimal you can't believe it, of course. The problem in America is not voter fraud. The problem is the voter suppression, that there are groups and entities that are trying to suppress the vote of in particular groups of Americans, minorities, etc. That's the real problem. Now, I didn't write the little card for it, but I also want you to know that they cleaned up government. Government was so much more efficient, so much more effective. Our cities are so much better. Our nation is so much better, basically, than it would have been in the Gilded Age, primarily because they just run it so much better. As problematic as it is, and you guys we're confronting huge problems at this moment, they are trying, though. They're trying very hard, and it's kind of a legacy of the progressive era that they would do they're trying to do what they can to make sure that we are safe as best they possibly can, even though it's such an overwhelming issue. Other really good things that come out of the progressive era are democratic reforms, and it should be small d democratic, but the initiative, referendum, recall, these were all really good ideas. Direct election of senators, direct primary, and of course the classic democratic reform of the votes for women, recognizing the right to vote for over 50% of the potential voting population, a huge development as far as America was concerned. So anyway, this becomes at least one of the outstanding contributions and really good outcomes of the progressive era. I don't know about you, but I feel like conservation was a wonderful idea, concern for our natural resources, the creation of the national forest system, of course, that you and I can take advantage of, critical development. And the good news about this is the sooner you start doing something like conservation, the more land that you actually can kind of protect, you can conserve. And the preservation, of course, program was in many ways associated with this. And then finally, consumer protection. I hope that you guys feel the same way that I do here, that this is a good idea, that they're watching. If it was just you and me and companies making products, that there could be problems there. That they're willing to sell us pretty much anything, okay? So someone kind of watching out for us, of course, with the labeling, checking out the meat, all those kind of things that become so critical. This, I think, is a critically important legacy. So there were some really good things that were done by the progressive era. There's no doubt about that. But unfortunately, there's some bad things about the progressive era too. And the bad is not so much that the progressives were being bad, rather it was things that they tried to do that pretty much fail. And the failures become kind of the issue that we confront as far as the progressive era is concerned. So one thing that they failed in was the regulations of big business. This turned into pretty much a monumental failure. And what we describe as happening, what historians say happened, is that the very big businesses that they were designed to regulate and control they captured the agencies that were designed to kind of regulate and control them. So that means that they captured the ICC, Interstate Commerce Commission, that's what it is, the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, and even the Federal Reserve. And so this is kind of how it worked. They're creating these agencies whose job it was to try to oversee these areas of economic enterprise. And so, and the idea was, of course, to make them safer, saner, and better for the consumer. So they create the agency like the ICC, and the ICC is designed to oversee interstate commerce. And one of the things that the ICC would oversee was railroads. So they're thinking to themselves, and there's a logic to this. They would think, now who knows the railroad industry the best in the United States? And of course, some of them would say, well, the CEOs of major railroads know it. So they began to appoint the CEOs of major railroads to the ICC. And they're going to do the same thing with the Federal Trade Commission. Who knows big business in America? Well, big businessmen know big business. So they're going to appoint them, the CEOs of major corporations, to be part of the FTC. And then they create the Fed, and they say, well, who knows the Fed, or who knows banking in America? And of course, Wall Street bankers know banking in America. So they appoint Wall Street bankers, and they still do, by the way. The Fed is just full of Wall Street bankers. But the problem was that these industries, these areas of business, kind of captured the very agency that was designed to regulate them. The railroads controlled the ICC. Big business controlled the FTC. Big banking controlled the Federal Reserve. And so my vision of this is kind of like hiring a bunch of wolves to protect the sheep from the wolves, and if you're hiring wolves to protect sheep, I'm feeling there's going to be a lot of dead sheep in the outcome. Over time, they realized their mistake, and they realized you can't just put big businessmen or big businesswomen on these commissions. You've got to have people from academia. You've got to have university professors. You've got to have economists. You've got to have people from the labor, from the working element. All of them have to be on. And so over time, these commissions became more sort of a reflection of what America was all about. Now, though they're still dominated by big business, there's no doubt about that. But the very capture of these agencies designed to regulate the big business, of course, meant that this would become a signal failure as far as the progressive era was concerned. More tragic is the failure of the social welfare reforms. These were the variety of things that I told you about that were conducted both on the city level, on the state level, and ultimately on the national level. Workmen's compensation, factory safety laws, things like that, okay? Now, the progressives passed the laws. There's no doubt about that, of course, with the intent of implementing them. But one of the issues in our constitutional regime is that, of course, all laws can be challenged in the courts, And what happened was the progressives were moving forward. They were progressive in their attitude and kind of seeing a new America. But the courts tended to be very much conservative in the old 19th century laissez-faire attitude. So when these laws were challenged in the courts, they would be routinely declared unconstitutional. The courts just cut down almost every single major social welfare law were taken out by the courts, basically. So all of those things that I told you about, it's almost like you have to go back in your notes and cross them out because they didn't happen, And among those things were the signal failure of the social welfare. Even something seemingly as necessary as the National Child Labor Law will be declared unconstitutional. And I always love to tell you how this happens because it kind of shows you the dynamics of lawyering. So the case was, taken by big companies, of course, that employed children. And those children were useful to them. They wanted them. They were cheap. They were nimble, of course. It was a good part of their labor source. So they didn't want to lose the children who were part of their companies, worked in their companies. So they go to court. But they were smart how they did it. They didn't go to court to defend their right to employ the children. Instead, they went to court and they defended the parental rights, the rights of the parents. The fact of the matter was that no 8-year-old gets up in the morning and says, Mom, I'm going to go work in a factory. Now, that's not the way it happened at all. Instead, every single one of those children that went to work in a factory was taken there by their parents. Their parents needed their children to work. So the parents would take them to the factory, of course, and then offer them to the factory. So the child labor law was not denying, of course, the employer's rights. It was denying parental rights, And I'm sure that the Supreme Court and other courts say, oh my God, we can't deny parental rights over the children. So they used this as the device to declare the National Child Labor Law unconstitutional. And of course, that meant that it was still legal to employ children as young as 8 years old in the factories and mines and mills of America. I do want you to know the progressives never gave up on the kids. They did not want the children to work in the factories. So they had to figure out some other way to make this happen. And it took them up till about the mid-20s, so about 1925 or so, before they really come up with an alternative. And what they came up with was, not a law that would pull the children out of the factory, but rather a law that would push the children someplace else. And I don't know if you guys can guess where they're going to push them, but I'm hoping that you're guessing they're going to push them into school. So the way that they got the children out of the factories was through compulsory education laws. You must go to school until you are, 15 years of age or something like that. And of course, this proved to be very, very effective, to say the least. It was very difficult to challenge this, that this was a bad idea to educate children until they're the age of 14 or 15 or something like that. So finally, the progressives found the way to make this happen, and they did not do it through child labor laws. Instead, they did it through compulsory education laws, and were able to get the kids out of the factory. So there will be ultimate success as far as child labor is concerned, but generally speaking, the social welfare activities of the progressive era, they fail. All of them fail. So this becomes sort of a negative manifestation, a bad manifestation of the progressive era. Finally, there's the ugly side of the progressive era. And I really haven't presented this to you in any particular, I've hinted at it maybe just a little bit, but this has come a little bit out of the blue, but this is clearly one of the signal issues associated with the progressive era. I'm going to describe the progressive for you guys as a part of what we call the black nadir. Now the word nadir means the lowest point, and black refers to African Americans. And so the point I'm going to try to make to you is that the period, and it's a longer period, so we take the black nadir, we start at about 1880 and we take it to about 1920. So there is a 40-year period there. And this is considered to be the worst time for African Americans in American history. It seems so counterintuitive, you would think that the worst time for African Americans has to be the period of slavery, for crying out loud, but believe it or not, the attitude is, and I'm adherent to this notion, the worst time for African Americans ever is really between 1880 and 1920, and the progressive era is right in the middle of the so-called black nadir. Now, you don't have to accept me just telling you this, of course. I have to make the argument, and that's what my intention is right now. So why do we call this era the black nadir? Well, one reason we call it the black nadir is I'm going to call it the high tide of racism. This is that time when kind of racism was at its absolute crest, and we can only hope that it is that. If it comes up again, oh my God, please don't do that to us, right? The high tide of racism, underwritten by this new kind of emerging pernicious concept called social Darwinism. Now, here's the way I want to introduce this to you. My grandfather served in World War I. And throughout his entire period of serving in World War I, he wrote a series of letters to his fiancée, and his fiancée was Lillian Meidel, who would become my grandmother. And of course, these were treasured letters, that Lillian, my grandmother, kept, of course. And the tragedy of these situations is you don't know about them until it's too late. So we didn't learn about this until after my grandfather died, after my grandmother died also. And it would have been so cool to be able to ask questions about the letters and everything. But my dad got his hands on these letters, and he decided he wanted to transcribe them. He's going to type them all out to make sure that everyone in the family had a copy. So he transcribed them, of course, painstakingly, put it all together by date and everything. Anyway, I remember the day that I got my copy. And so it came in a big envelope, of course, big legal-size envelope, and I opened it up, and my dad had put it in a nice folder, had a front piece on it, and then he had an introduction. And I was going, I'd been aware of the letters, I'd actually seen the actual copies of the letters, but I'm reading through his introduction. So he's just explaining everything I just explained to you, that these are the letters of my father, William Meidel, to his fiancée William Johnson, to my fiancée Lillian Meidel, blah, blah, blah. About halfway down the paragraph, though, my dad wrote, "I do not believe that my father was a racist." That's what he says. "I do not believe my father was a racist." And he makes some kind of those, not best friends, or blacks, but something like that, to say that he thought his father was even-handed with African Americans and others. And I'm just going, Dad, what are you doing? Why are you writing this down? So I start to read the letters, and what happened was my grandfather was sent to a training camp outside of Chicago. And it was a big training camp. A lot of the Midwestern guys came together. And the camp was divided in two parts. And one part was the white part, and one part was the black part. So the camps are right next to each other, but it's a segregated situation with the blacks on one side and the whites on the other. But they would intermix periodically in the PX and stuff, the camp stores. Well, my grandfather is describing the situation to my grandmother, and he is using the N-word as liberally as you can think of course, and a whole bunch of other racial epithets that I hadn't heard of before, like Carolina Smokies and stuff like that. And so anyway, I'm reading through this all, and I get down to the end of one of these letters, and I'm thinking about what my dad had said, and it's I want to call my father, "Hey, Dad, I think Grandpa was a racist." And I have to tell you guys that is the essential reality. My grandfather was a racist. Everybody was a racist in those days. And I want to tell you this, my other grandfather, my mom's dad, maybe less of a racist. He worked at a high school. He was an accounting teacher at Central High School in Omaha. Central High School was like the top high school. It was located in the old state capitol building up on this beautiful bluff, basically. And there was a homecoming election, and an African-American girl was elected the homecoming queen. And the school decided not to do this, because they thought that would be problematic for the general community. And when they gave the queen status over to some white girl, my grandfather protested against that. He thought that was illegitimate and not right. And for his troubles, he was transferred to South High School, which was one of the really kind of hard knock high school as far as Omaha was concerned. So maybe my other grandpa wasn't quite so much of a racist, but I'm sure that my Grandpa Johnson was a racist, because that's just the way it was. Everyone was a racist in that day. And it is the high tide of racism, where it simply dominates the thinking. And the primary reason we call it the high tide, though, is that they added to the traditional constructs of racism one new thing. So in the good old days, you can say that religious could be part of racism, and economics could be part of racism, social issue, cultural issue, the color of your skin could all be parts of racism. But what was added in the end of the 19th century was this thing called social Darwinism. Social Darwinism was a perversion of Darwinian thinking. It's kind of sad to Charles Darwin to include his name in what this is all about. It's all about evolution, of course, but the social Darwinists decided to take, well, here's the reality. All Homo sapiens have evolved to the same level. We are all evolved to that level, okay? So there's no Homo sapiens that are more evolved than anyone else. But the social Darwinists wanted to take a cultural interpretation of it. So there were some people on the face of the planet who seemed to be more advanced, who had evolved to a higher level. And of course, they're going to define that generally as the Europeans, and others that were not quite as advanced, of course. So we're inferior as far as the global population was concerned. And what I really want you guys to understand, and what the social Darwinist concept is about, is just it's an excuse for domination, excuse for exploitation. It's an excuse for abuse. If you wanted to abuse someone, that was a pretty simple way to simple thing. Well, I'm a superior person and they're inferior, and the Europeans will use it to, of course, conquer the rest of the world. Essentially, the corporate elite, the bourgeoisie, will use it to oppress the working class, or as an excuse for their oppression, basically. Henry Ford was a keen believer in the concept of social Darwinism. He simply saw himself as more evolved than its competitors, of course, and just about everybody else. And if I said Henry Ford, I meant John D. Rockefeller. He was, and Henry Ford would have believed it also, though. I mean, he's part of that same kind of thinking. And of course, in the United States, white people would use it as a way of, enforcing their notions of the inferiority of African Americans. So you gain this really powerful pseudoscience. The word pseudo means false, right? It's not true. False scientific racism is not true. Race is not even a basic. All these are fantasy notions that human beings have created. Anyway. Social Darwinism gave this pseudoscientific foundation, which unfortunately many people really believed. And if you don't understand kind of the dynamics of social Darwinism, remember where this is heading. The greatest graduate of the school of social Darwinism was Adolf Hitler. Hitler's going to take it to the incredible extreme, of course, of, not only are some people superior and inferior, but the inferior are parasitical. And of course, his focus was on the Jews, and his way of dealing with this, of course, was the elimination of the Jews, the Holocaust, the murder of close to 7 million Jews during the era of World War II. So, the horrific outcomes of those who truly believed in social Darwinism. The only good thing about Adolf Hitler, you never hear that sentence very often, do you? But the only good thing was he pushed everything so far. He pushed social Darwinism so far. He pushed racism so far that he caused a significant revulsion. Again, everyone begins to back off of racism out in the aftermath of World War II. Everyone backs away from social Darwinism. It's absolutely in disrepute today. So you at least get this moment. You go so far into it, of course, that people began to back away in horror from the outcomes of social Darwinism. But in the moment of the Black Nadir, African Americans are having to live with this new, more powerful, more virulent racism, which of course will cause them no end of trouble. It's also called the Black Nadir because I'm going to describe it as the lynching moment. This is the moment when lynching really dominates America. The great lynching moment in America is basically the same parameters as the Black Nadir from 1880 to about 1920. Now, whenever I ask the students what lynching means, they always come back to me and say something like it means to hang someone. And that is a form of lynching, that's true, but that's not really what lynching means. What lynching means is an extra legal, so outside of the law, but publicly sponsored, so like a group of people, a mob if you will, decide to do this kind of thing, murder of an individual. It doesn't matter how you do it, and sometimes they were hung, and sometimes they were tied to a tree and burned. There's a whole bunch of burnings that took place, just a horrible manifestation of lynching. Or sometimes they would just beat somebody to death, or they would shoot them, or they would drag them behind a vehicle until they died. It doesn't really matter how they did it, of course. These are all lynchings. So these were extra legal, outside of the parameters of law, but publicly sponsored. So that means that there at least is a public group who is making a decision here that this is the way they're going to proceed. And the image of lynching that I have is there's a horror to this moment, where let's say that you were an African-American young man and you were put in jail for some notion of some kind of problem, and then the mob would come after you. And of course, law enforcement would generally just stand aside because these were their friends and neighbors basically who were doing this. And the mob would grab you out of your cell and take you out to whatever the nearest tree, of course. And I think the thing that bothers me the most is that person in that moment thinking about what they're thinking, that there is no power on earth that can basically save them from the horrors that they're about to encounter. And that's going to be the end of their existence, essentially. But this is something that would happen routinely. During this period, we're looking at about 3,000 lynchings that occurred across the United States. And I do want you to know that it's somewhat of a national phenomenon. There were, and it depended, the minority element, the victims were minority groups from different areas. So in Dakotas, for instance, it would probably be a Native American that would be lynched. In California, it might be a Mexican or an Asian person that would be lynched. But the primary center, the center of lynching in America was indeed the South. And the primary victims were African American men. Now, one of the questions is, of course, why? Why are these people being lynched? And, it shows an insecurity. Clearly, it shows an insecurity on the part of the white population that maybe they felt that they were losing control in some particular kind of way. And this is the aggressive way that they would respond to this. But more specifically, routinely, the excuse for lynching was some notion of some sexual depredation. It's that racist component, of course, of the black as a sexual predator, almost always trying to target a white woman. And of course, there is no foundation to that. That is simply, it's part of the racist fantasy, the horrible fantasies of racism that developed in America. But, any situation, real or imagined, where an African American man was interactive with a white woman, and it could be consensual, it doesn't matter, what it would have happened. And understand that real or imagined, oftentimes it didn't happen at all. Yet it was simply understood to have happened or claimed to have, alleged to have happened. Then that individual, that African American male, was found their life at risk in a very serious kind of way. It always makes me think, of course, of To Kill a Mockingbird and that poor African American man, of course, and all he was trying to do was help a desperate white woman who's trying to find some milk of human kindness from someone, and she wants him to come in to help move the chevreau. I don't even know what the heck a chevreau is, some furniture or something like that, and he's trying to do it for her, and she hugs him, she grabs on him, she's just trying to make that kind of connection of some level of intimacy. And of course, he kind of knows that this spells his doom. He knows that he is doomed, and he plays it wrong. He runs from law enforcement. The mob are kind of going to come after him and going to kill him. But for many African American men, any impropriety that could be perceived, could be problematic, could be ultimately bring about their particular end. And so this horrible kind of manifestation is appearing, especially in the American South. I have to tell you that one of the things that's kind of so horrible about it is that there are so many pictures of lynchings. The people that were the lynchers were often proud of what they did, and we have these pictures of the victim, and then we have the picture of the crowd, and oftentimes it's at night, and oftentimes they all look glazed. They've probably been doing a lot of drinking. But this was a routine phenomenon. In fact, there were even postcards you could buy in the South. You could have been down in Alabama and send your grandma a picture of a lynching, a lynching postcard or something like that. Anyway, this becomes just a horrible expression, of course, the violent expression of the black nadir. Another thing I don't have a card for was Blackface entertainment. This was the most prominent entertainment in America as we're heading into the turn of the century. It was an entertainment entirely based upon racial stereotyping and making fun of black people. And I'm sure you guys know something about this, of course. It's where the actor would paint their face black with exaggerated features of eyes and lips and then come out. And I have to tell you that in some ways it probably was tremendously I'm not going to say it probably was entertaining. It was song, it was dance, it was jokes, it was it had its kind of own amazing spectacle associated with it. But all of it was grounded in this racial stereotyping and using the blacks as the foil of all humor that would be developed at that particular time. So anyway, Blackface entertainment was a huge phenomenon at that time. anytime anyone does anything blackface, and I think that there was some fancy European fashion people who did some blackface stuff just recently, you have to understand what that means. And when people have done blackface for Halloween or something, I mean, you're dredging up not just that entertainment activity, but all of the components of the black nadir, including lynching and racism. And you have to understand, you do blackface, and you're dredging up some really negative, really nasty components as far as America's concerned. Even in my youth, I can remember remnants of kind of blackface, the radio shows, Amos and Andy, not that I listened to that, of course, but I heard the remnants of that. Two white men pretending to be black guys and, of course, making all these ridiculous kind of jokes and stuff like that. I remember that there were African Americans who would be like the butler of Jack Benny or something like that, and, of course, kind of goofy and ridiculous and funny in their humorous in their behavior, but also, of course, based upon the racial stereotyping. They even say like the crows in the animated movie Dumbo are representing the blackface. I mean, there was a lot of this on display. I have to tell you that when I was a Boy Scout, we'd actually sing a song that came from that kind of minstrel blackface time. It was a fun song to sing. In the evening by the moonlight, you could hear those darkies singing. This is Roddy-doo-rah. This is the kind of thing that they would do, the music that they would have. But anyway, blackface entertainment, again, a powerful manifestation of the black nadir. Forgot one little thing. There were many African Americans who actually performed in blackface. And I'm sure that it was just, in fact, one of the most famous of the performers was an African American. I do want you to know that whenever they did it, of course, they also did the blackface. They never came out in their natural face. And I think that it was at least a suggestion that this is a mask, of course, of drama or of comedy that they're representing. They're not themselves in any kind of way. But I'm sure for them it was often very problematic to be performing in an art form that really, of course, belittled them, or in an entertainment form that belittled them on every single occasion. Another manifestation of the black nadir is something called convict slavery. Convict slavery was a phenomenon of the South in the latter part of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century. And what happened was that for a minor offense, so let's just say it could be like loitering or something like that, all right? Crossing the street or jaywalking. You could be brought before a judge in the South as an African American, and there'd be a fine attached to you. And if you couldn't attach the fine, then of course there's an alternative. You either were put in jail, or you could be purchased by someone. Someone could pay your fine, and they would have your labor for a year. And this became a source of labor as far as the South was concerned in a major kind of way. We're talking tens of thousands of black Southerners, especially young men, of course, caught up in some minor misdemeanor offense in one way or the other, whose fines were then paid for by someone who wished to employ them, and they could employ them for the entire year. And this was done not only by farmers, but also by small businesses and even major business concern. United Steel in Birmingham, Alabama employed convict labor. And we call it convict slavery because that's really what it was. These individual workers were taken in, and for that year they were treated like slaves. They were abused in every way you possibly could imagine. And one of the worst things was that they weren't even treated as well as slaves. I mean, you just had them for a year, so they were often treated with maximum kind of abuse and very little care for their well-being. And so not only were tens of thousands of people brought into convict slavery at this period, but thousands of them would die during the period of when they were the convict slave. And I read a book on it, and I have to tell you, I just stopped the book after about 2/3. I was so sick of all the horrible stuff that they were telling me. I mean, that I didn't need to know more about it. I could already see how horrible it was, of course. I decided I just couldn't even finish that. I actually did have a Blackface entertainment card. Sorry about that. I missed it. Anyway, all these are components of the black nadir. The fact that racism is at a high tide, that you do indeed have lynching, that you have blackface entertainment, that you have these are all component parts of the black nadir. Now, one thing I need to tell you about these things I've told you, they are not specifically an issue of the progressive era. Racism was a global phenomenon, to say the least. Lynching occurred all across the entire country, though really was focused primarily in the South, of course. I'm sure there were progressives that enjoyed blackface entertainment. I have no doubt there would have been Southern progressives who perhaps employed convict slavery, but those are not specifically the problem of the progressive. I mean, these are not things the progressives necessarily did. But the progressives did do their own things, of course, to become foundations of the black nadir. And one of the things that I really want to highlight for you, and I've already suggested this to you a little bit before when we were doing Reconstruction, was that the progressives in the South will decide that it will be a political reform to begin the process of disenfranchising African American voters. So disenfranchisement is a potential identification. It's going to be on your midterm, of course. It's also one of the longest words I ever write on the board, but here, of course, it's all squeezed down on a little piece of paper. To disenfranchise is to take rights away, essentially. The root word here is the franchise, and the franchise actually comes to us all the way from the Germanic tribes, the Franks, and all that meant really was call yourself a Frank was to be that you were a free person. And the Franks invaded into Gaul, and they became the French. And so when you're saying French, in some ways, you're just saying freedom. So to disenfranchise is to take the freedoms away or to take the rights away. And that's what's going to happen as far as Southern blacks are concerned in terms of their vote. Now, the foundation of disenfranchisement is something I've already suggested to you, and I do wish I did have a little card for it, but it's the loopholes of the 15th Amendment. I think you guys remember the 15th Amendment. 15th Amendment says you cannot deny a citizen the right to vote because of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And, it's suggestively good in some ways, but of course it creates a listing, right, that you can't deny people the right to vote because of these particular reasons, but you can come up perhaps with a whole bunch of other reasons why you can deny them the right to vote. It took a while for this to happen. I'm intrigued, like it didn't happen immediately. So we have Reconstruction. By 1868, blacks are voting in the South, of course. It's not really till the 1890s that I think the Southern states began to realize the potential of the loopholes, and they began to move to take advantage of them. And so they began to use a variety of qualifications which they could use to disenfranchise the black voters. And among the things they're going to use, and I think I did mention these a little bit, they're going to use literacy requirements. And that makes sense to some degree. They're all going to the secret ballot now, so you have to be able to read the ballot. But clearly they knew what they were doing. So few African Americans were literate that this would be an effective way of removing them from the voting rolls. They're going to use poll taxes. There's a history of poll taxes. It was like the original income tax. It was a demonstration that you were a participant in the community, so you'd pay a little money, which would allow you to recognize your right to vote. Routinely, African Americans didn't have the money to pay that. Property requirements go way back. In fact, back to the colonial period, you look at the original kind of qualification for voting was what they called the 40-shilling freehold, which meant that you had to have 40 shillings worth of property to be allowed to vote. It wasn't much property that you needed, but there was at least something of there. If that property requirement was land, then that often would exclude African Americans who weren't able to acquire land, of course. They could even use the difficult registration procedures, just make it difficult for them. They weren't necessarily paper people who kept paper or kept records in any kind of way. So even using kind of the registration process was an effective way. In fact, even today they're doing that, That's some of those kind of that voter exclusion stuff that you have to have a special ID card or something like that, that maybe you're not so good at keeping something like that. Even today, these are being used, of course, to potentially disenfranchise particular people. Oftentimes, lower income, minority people in places like the South that have been very kind of aggressive in these types of exclusions. But these were things that they were doing in terms of this moment of disenfranchisement. Now the only problem with these things were that they could impact white people too. So you could disenfranchise poor whites who were unable to read, who couldn't afford poll taxes or the other kind of thing. So for some progressives in the South, they didn't care. They said, well, that's all right. We'll get rid of all the poor people. But for most progressives, no, we don't want to disenfranchise white people. We simply want to disenfranchise black people. So they're going to come up with these kind of special things, special devices which they will use. And one of the more famous or infamous was called the Grandfather Clause. Now the Grandfather Clause was instituted by the state of Mississippi. And this is its kind of popular name. What the law actually said was that to vote in Mississippi, you had to have a male relative who voted in the election of 1867. Now, the election of 1867 was the last all-white election. So by creating this little component, you effectively eliminate any ability of any black person to be able to vote. And I have to tell you that, this was clearly an intent to try to deprive African Americans of the vote. And they will challenge it. It will be challenged in the courts. There's a case called Williams versus the state of Mississippi. It got to the Supreme Court in 1898. And it's just amazing what happened. Here comes this case, and clearly, Mississippi is trying to deny black people the right to vote. But the Supreme Court put its blinders on, and it said, well, the law says nothing about race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So the Grandfather Clause was allowed to stand, and it would be, of course, a device to disenfranchise blacks as far as Mississippi was concerned. Now, many other states decided to go a little bit of a different way, and this became known as the Understanding Clause. The Understanding Clause. The Understanding Clause was a subjective test that would be taken by the applicant who's trying to register for the right to vote. And they would go to the registrar, and the registrar would say, we have an Understanding Clause, and they would be given a test, either verbal or perhaps even written. Now, the problem with the Understanding Clause was that it was very subjective. So the registrar could choose the question that they would ask the individual. If it's a white person coming to try to register for a vote, a very simple question. If it's an African American, you could make it a very difficult question. I'm pretty sure the movie Selma starts with that, and it's Oprah Winfrey, and she's trying to register to vote in Alabama. And the registrar starts just asking her a series of questions about the political structures of Alabama. And they keep becoming more and more complicated and complex till I think the final question was like, can you name the names of all the members of the legislature of the state of Alabama? And no, who could remember all of that? And so she finally does fail to answer, and because of that, he's disallowing her ability to vote. So using all of these devices together, be it poll taxes, literacy requirements, property requirements, registration, the Understanding Clause, the Grandfather Clause, the southern states began to effectively eliminate the right to vote for African Americans. Thus, by the time we get to 1905, less than 5% of blacks can vote, and of eligible blacks who should have been able to vote could vote as far as the South is concerned. And so that just simply means that they are essentially eliminating black people from the ability to vote. And I need you to understand what that means in real terms. If you don't vote, no one's going to care about you. You will not get respect. You'll have no voice. You'll get no recognition, at least within the civil society of the United States of America. No local politician is going to care about you. No state politician is going to care about you. No national politician is going to care about you. You become a political non-entity. And indeed, of course, you're not going to be represented as far as the government is concerned. I always like to understand this dynamic, because there's a story that kind of makes me think of, lets me tell you what's going on here. So I don't know if you guys have ever heard of a man by the name of George Wallace, but George Wallace was a Democratic politician from Alabama, and prominent primarily in the 1960s. He rose to be the governor of Alabama. He ran primarily on a segregationist ticket. So his idea was that he was going to maintain segregation as far as the South was concerned. And one of his famous heroic acts was to stand on the steps of the University of Alabama. They were trying to enroll an African American student, and he basically stood there, blocking the way into the admissions building, saying, "You shall not pass," this kind of thing. I have to tell you that was all pretty much for show. The next day, the young man came and actually did register to attend Alabama. Can you imagine being the one white student at the University of Alabama? And so what that young man had to do, I think it was in 1962, just sort of an awful situation. Anyway, here's George Wallace, who's an absolute segregationist and, manifesting as pretty much an absolute racist. Well, along comes the Voter Rights Act, and now that means that the blacks of Alabama can vote. And that same segregationist politician, George Wallace, is now shaking black hands and kissing black babies, and he's telling them he loves them because he wants their votes. Politicians only care about those who actually vote, and when the African Americans are unable to vote in the South, of course, they're not going to be cared for at all, and this reduces them to, great, at most, second-class citizenship, of course, but becomes one of the hallmarks, essentially, of the black nadir, the fact that the blacks in the South are simply being deprived of their essential political right. It wasn't enough for the progressives to simply deny African Americans the right to vote, but they also sought to publicly separate white people from black people as far as the South was concerned. And this would become the phenomenon that we call segregation. And I want you to know about segregation. And it is a powerful, powerful manifestation of the black nadir. Now, to tell the story of segregation, I'm going to tell you the story associated with this individual by the name of Homer Plessy. And Homer Plessy becomes our potential identification, within the context of the progressive era and the black nadir. To be honest with you, I don't really know that much about Homer Plessy. I know that he was about 29 years old at the time that he was engaged in these activities. I know that he was what we call a mulatto. And a mulatto just simply means mixed race. The word is in some ways kind of an indication of the general racism of America. Mulatto comes from a Latin base that is related to the same word as mule. And a mule, of course, is a cross-species animal that result of the mating of a donkey and a horse, essentially. So you're connecting this, this cross fertilization is taking place, and here was a mixture between a white and a black person. Now, Homer Plessy would be described as a 1/8 mulatto. So that means that if you line up all of his great-grandparents, only one of them, out of all 8 of them, was actually a black person. But in America, of course, any little taint of black blood, and of course you guys all know there's no such thing as black blood, meant that you were an African American. I was reading this morning an article on that's, all the fictional stuff that deals with passing, that there were many African Americans who, were these mulattoes, had a little bit of African American ancestry, yet at some point actually could pass for white, sometimes blonde and blue-eyed, and sometimes they did, a way of escaping, of course, the oppression, but also putting them in another situation, not necessarily linked to their white, the black community, of course, or separated from it, oftentimes because they had to, because of the veil of secrecy around this, but also not necessarily feeling absolutely comfortable within a larger white society. Just it shows another one of the problematic components of race in America. Anyway, Homer Plessy was a very light-skinned African American, but clearly African American, from other physical characteristics. Anyway, what he was doing was he was confronting what he would do. He simply volunteered to become part of a legal situation. And what he wanted to do was to challenge a Louisiana exclusion law. So this was a law that was passed in the state of Louisiana, which excluded African Americans from riding in the first-class cars on railroads. It's not technically a segregation law, because segregation means to actually separate the races, but this is more an exclusion law.